Hey, this is Patrick Clark, creator of Project Mockingbird, the thing that makes tiny whoops fly great, apparently.
Boy, does it ever make not just, I mean, tiny whoops, any micro quad. I feel confident saying that, I mean, I don't want to blow you up, but you might be one of the best tuners of micros, certainly the most prolific tuners of micros in the world today.
I stand on the shoulders of giants that came before me. No, it's really true. It's like I know so many people that have done this forever, like way back in the day. So I just took what they taught me and applied it. So, but thank you.
That that is, I mean, that is true. That's true for everyone. That's true for myself as well. There's certainly something to be said for, like, there's a whole lot of people who are way smarter than me about Betaflight, for example, and they are making Betaflight. And then someone has to be out there to kind of take that information, translate it for the masses, if you will, and that's sort of where I stand. And so I'm visible, but I'm not. And maybe you feel like you're the
I
same
no,
way.
it's the same exact way. Like my background is I have an art degree, right, and I got into flying, right, and so I hooked up with like Travis Schrock, who's not fast enough, right, famous silverware guy,
Wait,
and
wait.
he started,
That's his pilot name, not a
yeah,
description of how fast.
yeah,
Okay, not
yeah,
fast enough. Okay, just want
yeah,
to make
which is
sure.
always funny, right? I'm like, dude, you're fast. He's like, but never fast enough. But
I got it.
he'll talk to me. The same thing with like UAV Tech, Mark, those guys.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, dudes, you're talking way over my head. But the cool thing is they can interpret what I tell them and say, oh, what you mean is, and they spit out some math. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, cool. And then they teach me how to apply that. And then, I think where I try to do it is how do I apply that kind of stuff to just commonality to figure stuff out and get it working so that people can fly better.
Yeah. I almost, it's funny. I did not expect to find this commonality between us, but I feel like I really am identifying with what you're saying. That in some way, like I'm just kind of like a PR guy or a translator, a marketing guy, if you will, for Betaflight. And I sit in the room with guys like Mark Spatz, and they just give me all kinds of technical stuff. And I'm like, okay, how can I put this so the most number of people can benefit from it?
Right.
You
No,
know,
it's true. Like, and that's where Travis. He always tells me, he goes, "You frustrate me because you tune by the seat of your pants, but you're usually right." I'm like, right, and then he says, "Okay, based on what you did, here's what we should do math wise." This may, and
right?
Mark does the same thing. Like, it's like when we were working on RPM filtering and we were going back and forth. There was a lot of like that doesn't feel right, Mark. And he goes, "But the math is correct." I'm like, but it doesn't feel right, Mark. So, right, and that's the beauty of putting science to actual things. Is if it's just science, you can't. It's not applied, right? It's not how
Yeah.
a pilot feels in the air, like any sort of
Well,
racing.
that's why I think racing is, in some sense, the ultimate test of theory, and it's why like all of automobile development happens in racing, right?
Yep.
Because at the end of the day, either you finish faster or you don't. It's very objective. And if you say, well, the PID controller is absolutely perfect because mathematically the lines overlap, well, okay, but if I'm not winning races with it,
It's so true, and that's the thing is like when I first started doing PID tuning on these tiny whoops, and I was doing like the P to D ratio is almost 1 to 1. People were like, "That is totally wrong. That is no," and I'm like, "Fly it," and right, and then Mark did some black box on his, and he was like, "Yeah, a 1 to 1 ratio for a whoop is crazy, but it works, right?" So I like
nice,
that mixture.
nice. Well, let's talk about Project Mockingbird, and I would love to go back. I'm trying to think of the very first quad I heard of. Ooh, have you guys tried the Project Mockingbird tune? What was the first quad that you tuned under Project Mockingbird?
It was a um, I'm gonna forget the actual board, but it was a oh my gosh, it was an old brushed, one of the first Betaflight brushed FCs, and it wasn't even serial. Like it was an old PPM,
Wow.
like because we were flying Inductrix, right? And Jesse was like, "Oh, I hate these Betaflight boards," and I'm like, "Yeah, but the Inductrix you can only use certain motors, and the yaw is kind of sloppy,
Right.
and so a lot of us kind of bought these first FCs. I knew nothing. I knew nothing about PPM or any of that, so it was just some random. Man, I wish I could
Yeah.
remember what it was, or even maybe
Well,
a
now
Furious FPV one, something like
I
that, something like super old.
the earliest brushed Betaflight board I can think of is there was an SP Racing Nano or something that had brushed
Yeah,
motor drivers. It's the earliest one I can think of, but I can't. I maybe there was something
yeah.
before it. I don't know.
It's sitting in a drawer somewhere because I never throw anything away. But yeah, and it was PPM, so it was terrible, right? And I was putting that
Right.
up against the Inductrix, which was 11 millisecond DSMX, and I was like,
Right.
"This is garbage," right? And I thought it was me that I couldn't tune, but I learned a lot.
And I guess you were just motivated to get the most out of that, and then it just sort of snowballed
it
from there.
it was like I belong to the micro motor warehouse community. A lot of super smart guys into micros there, and I started asking questions like, I want it to fly like the Inductrix. How do I do that? And then somebody hooked me up to a guy named Scott Allen who had tried to do that in Betaflight, and he was a lot of where I learned a lot of the early stuff. And that's why it's named Project Mockingbird, because I was trying to mimic or mock.
Oh.
Yeah, I knew
Well,
nothing
let's
about the government
there was
conspiracy
so
thing, right?
just to make sure, yeah. So when if you try and Google Project Mockingbird, actually you're starting to show up on the lists. By the way, in the search results, but for a long time, if you tried to look for Project Mockingbird, you just found this old CIA experiment or
Right.
something from the '60s, and who knows what that was all about. But um, so let's talk about your goal was to mimic the Inductrix. For people who don't know, what was the or is the Inductrix, and why is or was it so special?
Yeah, it was one of the first micros that Jesse and his crew, like, it was this cheap little 65 millimeter quad that somebody stuck a camera on, and it was made by Horizon Hobby Blade, and only DSMX, right? So only Spectrum, and somebody stuck a camera on it, and it just worked really, really well for flying around a house, and it crashed really well, and it had good power, and it was just easy, right? In like 5 minutes, you could get one up and running.
Right, Horizon Hobby's known for being easy to use, and that was, if I remember right, that was when Jesse Perkins, Mister Tiny Whoop, that was the first Tiny Whoop, was because the Inductrix originally didn't have FPV gear on it,
Right.
but it was just this little 65 millimeter brushed quad that you could fly around with your Spectrum transmitter,
Yep.
and he stuck it on there, and it became the first Tiny Whoop. But
Yep.
then the flight controller didn't run Betaflight.
No, you're totally locked out. People, we would like go into our Spectrum radios and change the throws on it and do everything we could on the radio to like increase the yaw rates. But it was all stick, right? Had nothing. You couldn't program anything on it. So you basically, once we got motors that were above 19,000 kV, it would just shake like crazy, right?
Right,
So you
right.
couldn't do any tuning, and so we were reaching a limit. They were really easy, really great, but I was like, I'm not satisfied with that.
Yeah, I remember Jesse sent me some motors a while back. This was a long time ago. And he said, you can try these whatever motors, the top end motors, but when the battery's full, it shudders a lot. And I'm like, well,
Right.
why don't you just turn down the P gates? And he's like, no, we're completely locked out of the flight controller. We can't change anything. And I was like, oh. So I
Yeah.
definitely see why you would try to make it like you want Betaflight so you can tune it and stuff. But what kind of stuff did the Inductrix do that Betaflight didn't or doesn't that made
Right.
it so good?
Well, and I wish I knew this way back then. The way the PID controller was written on the Inductrix is kind of like with silverware. It puts motor power before any filtering, so you instantly get more power than you would in Betaflight. And then in Betaflight, there's angle mode is, I think it's for old clean flight. I think was the last time anybody even touched it. So the way they calculated yaw on the Inductrix was different, and so those things kind of combined, and the crash handling. Like one of the big problems with Betaflight is crashing, and it's because there's this overflow that happens, right? And you start spinning, and I term goes way up, and it takes like 4 seconds to recover.
Right.
The Inductrix did not have that problem. It's still probably one of the better ones to handle crashing.
Well, that's something I've noticed about flying like tiny whoops indoors is you ever had the experience where you're flying like a 5-inch outdoor and you crash and you go, oh, I'm done for, and you disarm. And then it just feels like 15 seconds as your quad flies through the air and you're like, oh, I really could be flying out of this right
Right,
now.
right,
Do I have
right.
time to, do I have time to get a cup of coffee before I rearm?
Yep,
But indoors, the minute you hit something, you're just down. There's just nowhere
yep,
to go.
yeah.
And a quad that will recover quickly and lets you stay in the air. That's why I say that flying in angle mode, when you're flying indoors, you should fly in angle mode.
Yeah, there is a response time on angle mode because right, your pitch controllers kind of pitch and roll are now just controlled by angle strength, and
Right.
so that little minute movement, like what you have to do in acro is so it's a bigger movement, and because you're on bigger courses, once you shrink that down, those micro movements are so hard to do.
Yeah.
The angle mode just does it better. But the problem was really high P gains on tiny whoop size things, and the controller would kind of spin out, and you would it's really really old code, so that
Yeah.
was kind of the things that I soon ran into a wall of in Betaflight where it did certain things really well, but then I find out that it just does certain things not as well.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the takeaway is that the Inductrix was written from scratch to be flown in angle mode. Whereas there's just no secret that the Betaflight devs are very, very focused on freestyle and racing, and angle mode is kind of there, but nobody really cares about it. Nobody's putting a lot
Right.
of thought into
And
it.
from the Betaflight devs themselves, and I totally agree with them. Angle mode they treat as beginner mode.
Yeah. And that's
So
just not true. That's just not true for tiny whoops.
no, it's not. And I understand their audience, right? It's a bigger audience, so that's why Silverware and Emuflight come out with things that can focus on these things.
So let's talk about then. So Silverware is a open source firmware that came along after the Inductrix. Doesn't
Yep,
run on Betaflight boards. Is that right? You have to have a
that
different
is
flight controller.
it. Is an Yep, it's an F0 only,
Okay.
and it was written for like some of the toy Bayang protocol, cheap stuff, and then a guy Silver XXX
Yeah.
like figured out how to get into the firmware of it and rewrote it, and and he found out that wow, this is specifically written for this size of angle mode craft, and
Yeah.
started building on it.
So you flew the Inductrix and you liked how it flew and you went to Betaflight and you tried to emulate that. What kind of changes did you have to make to Betaflight's like default tune? Because I've noticed there are some common things across all your
Yeah.
tunes. What kind of stuff do you have to do to make Betaflight fly better on a micro?
Well, at the time, like the thing was to watch Stingy's video on how to tune, right? So I tried my first tune for a tiny whoop was when he made that video. I'm like, oh, this solves all my problems, but it didn't really apply. I
So
mean, it did,
his video is
right?
basically just focusing on getting the P, the I, and the D gains right. So
Yeah,
get your PID gains dialed in.
right. Do it all line of sight, kind of all of that. And I tried, and it really did help. I learned a lot about how to PID tune from that. But then trying to apply it to a tiny whoop, it's where it's like, okay, unknown territory. So I learned. So that's where I started digging into like the history of Betaflight and like when angle mode was added, and then I found out that by the way, pitch and roll rates don't even work in angle mode. I'm like, here I was like trying to do stuff. I'm like, oh, what if I increase my rates on pitch and roll? And I'm like, does that feel any different? No. And I was like, why is this not right? So then looking it up, I learned a lot about Betaflight and how angle mode was implemented. And that changed how I did my tune, where I was like, oh, okay, there's the tune and then there's rates. And the
Right.
tune has been from the beginning always an evolution. And I think now that we have black box data, and the first one that I did with black box data was Alien Whoop actually made a Betaflight FC that had black box. And that was the first time that I used really smart people to look at my black box data and say, what am I doing wrong here? And that's where I started getting into, it is this P to D ratio is like nothing else. right? Because when I started going up to that level, I would stop because I'm like, okay, I'm going into levels that
Yeah.
it's saying danger, danger, danger. Don't ever
Yeah.
do this.
Like on the bigger
Even, you know,
quads, it's common to see P's be, let's say, 1.5 to 2 times the gain of D's,
yep,
roughly.
yep,
And these little quads, you just now I guess you were raising D a lot.
raising D a lot, and then P was going up. When I'm putting it in, when I got to the point where I started putting 100 in for P,
Yeah.
people are like, "You are crazy!" Like I'm like, but it's flying really, really
Well,
well. It's like we're not supposed to do that.
that's what I remember when. Now I certainly don't have as much experience tuning micros as you do, but when I first started tuning micros, little brushed whoops, I remember having to just crank the P gain through the roof because those little motors just had so little thrust and so little torque that you just had to like just drive the hell out of them to
Yeah,
get any kind of and the just it felt like the higher you raised the P gain, the better it flew, and it never got to the point where it wobbled or oscillated
right,
because it
right,
just didn't have enough authority.
right. And we were also doing brushed motors, right? So
Right.
a lot of this the advice I got was on brushless, and it made total sense when I was doing my brushless bigger quads, but it just didn't make sense on brush. So there was just a lot of trial and error, a lot of asking very smart people like Travis, who has been invaluable in how I do things because he's super smart and knows a lot of math, right? And could make sense. And that's the thing with I think you found this too, where if I can tell somebody something and they can translate it into math,
Yep.
that's a great relationship. And that's what I do with Travis is, even on Betaflight stuff, I'll be like, Travis, it's doing something crazy. And he's like, well, tell me how it's doing it. And then he's like, oh, yeah, your eyes are blah, 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 blah. And you need to do, I'm like, I love you. You fix right. And then it works. Right. So, but based on if he wouldn't come up with that himself because
Right.
it's not how he thinks.
Right. Right. So, how much of what you do would you say is like PID tuning, P the I the D gain, and then there are other things that I've seen you set up, like the camera angle mix, that
Yep.
up tilt compensation. You adjust the level strength, which I suppose is PID tuning. How much of it is just straight PID tuning, and how much of it is other features that you are enabling or changing to change how the quad flies?
Yeah, actually, Project Mockingbird started out not caring about. I didn't want a PID tune. I really, really didn't. It was more focusing on. So there's a couple of things that this was Scott Allen, the guy who kind of I learned a lot from. He said FPV angle mix matches kind of how Inductrix does yaw around the gravity center, the gravity, instead of using, I think, the gyro.
Right.
Um, and he said, but don't do it full strength. And I'm like, I don't understand. He goes, but it putting it at this certain percentage mimics how that does it. And then there was other things like angle strength is your PID tuning. And I'm like,
Right.
oh, right. And so a lot of it was figuring that stuff out. So it is like rate changes, which a lot of people say your rates are personal. But in tiny whip racing, I think what I've done is to try to, it's a little more narrow. Like I know my yaw rate is super high, like it's 2.1 and it's linear. So it's a linear RC rate. But when you put that with the FPV angle mix and things like that, and you shrink it down to a tiny whip course, that's how people get fast. And
Yeah.
the funny thing is, I was watching your video on Emuflight, and when you put that on, you were like your first battery. I was like, dude, he's getting faster. Like you're doing that little loop around there. I'm like, dang.
I felt that way too. I mean, I felt so. I released a video for those who are watching this and maybe didn't see that one, where I put Project Mockingbird on a Mobula 6 and flew it, and my first reaction the minute I moved the yaw stick was the yaw rate's higher. But my philosophy is that you should always give something a fair chance, because I'm a very like my first reaction is always going to be, nah, I'm just going to do it my way. But then I would never learn anything. So I really wanted to give it a fair chance, and I flew it on your rates. And I felt faster and more confident doing it. But I also felt like I was crashing a lot more because I was just kind of stomping.
Right?
I was pushing myself so much more. I feel like I looked like I was flying sloppier, but I feel like with time I would have gotten used to it and would have gotten a lot faster.
Right, and I had Goose, who used to be with Newbie Drone, right? He was one of the first people at Newbie Drone to fly Project Mockingbird, and kind of how we started that relationship. And he hated it. He hated it, and we joke about it now that he was like, "This Project Mockingbird is stupid. I should only fly Horizon or Acro." And then I finally convinced him, and I said, "Fly my exact tune for a week." And he
Yep.
was like, he got used to that yaw. And so FPV angle mix, right, for those that don't know, it puts a lot of your pitch and roll all on your yaw stick,
Yeah.
right? So and
Basically means you turn with the yaw stick mostly instead of having to coordinate roll and yaw together.
yep.
More
And
or
so
less.
in a lot of tiny whip courses, especially the ones that like Jesse makes, there's a lot of hairpins. There's a lot of, like you had in your last video, where you
Right.
do the little Jacob's ladder type of things where you're looping through. And at that micro size, man, having it all on a yaw
Yeah.
helped a lot. So people have tried to apply this, including myself. I'm like, how would it feel to put this on a 5 inch and run angle mode on a bigger course? It doesn't quite translate,
It doesn't seem to work. I don't know why,
right?
but it doesn't.
But you shrink it down, and on typical tiny whip courses, which is, they are getting bigger now. So
Yep.
I have seen guys that are flying acro on some of these bigger courses. I'm like, of course that's you're going to be able to be fast there. But yeah, so we did that, and then early on, we also had one of the things the Inductrix has is, with when you pitch or roll, it adds motor power, and that helped a lot, especially when we had those first
Oh,
underpowered motors.
I see what you mean. Because my first thought was, well, of course it adds motor power because you pitch and the back motors get faster. But what you mean is when the quad tilts, it raises the throttle to keep it from descending. Now,
Yep.
normally you have to do that manually,
Yeah.
but it does it automatically.
Yeah, and that was underpowered brushed motors, and it was something that was missing from what I felt like the Inductrix did really well. And then somebody, I think from the Blade team, actually told me, yeah, we actually do. They called it motor mixing.
Hmm.
So I added that via the radio, which was
Yeah, I
not the
remember that.
greatest.
I
Right, it
remember
was a
that.
pain in the ass to set up, and it actually didn't work that great. But then somebody found out that there's an old Betaflight piece of code from CleanFlight that added that. So we added that.
Now we're talking about all these features that were in the original Inductrix firmware or in Silverware, but not in Betaflight. And that brings us to today, where you're working with the Emuflight guys, and they're like just pulling all this stuff into Emuflight. Is that right? So
Yeah. Yep.
that's where you're doing your latest tunes, right?
Yeah, Kevin, Quick Flash, one of the developers at Emuflight, he knew I was a fan of Butterflight. A lot of the Whoop guys were flying Butterflight for a while because it was just super, super easy to tune. And so when he started that up, he actually was asking Travis, not fast enough, on one of the Silverware channels, some questions. And I was like, well, wait a second, what are you working on? And he's like, yeah, it's Emuflight, it's kind of like Betaflight, but we're trying to add some Whoop features, and I really like what Silverware is doing. And I'm like, hold on, let's talk.
Yeah.
And it really was the same kind of relationship where he's really interested in getting Whoops to fly better as well. And he's like, well, what if I just kind of look at what Silverware is doing, and we start talking and put it in, and you fly it? And I was like, please talk more, because as we know, you can do Silverware, but it has
Yeah.
that same problem the Inductrix has. To program it is a pain. There is
Right.
no plug it in a configurator that has a USB port type of thing.
Oh,
So
okay.
right, you have to get like a Keel program, type in code,
Oof.
and yeah,
Well,
yeah,
that's the real power I think of well, it was Clean Flight, it was Base Flight before that, and now it's Beta Flight and Emu Flight. Is that all these platforms are based on the same hardware and the same software at their core, and it means that it's like the ultimate power of open source development in a way, because something like Heliospring can come along and Butterflight, and they could just take Betaflight and copy paste it and do some things different. And now we've got Emuflight, and they're just sort of bringing all this stuff in, but they don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch. And that's so exciting to me. It's got to be
yeah.
exciting to you.
Oh, totally. And the thing is, then I see Kevin talking to Travis, And I'm like, oh my gosh, now we're dangerous because Kevin's a very, very smart man. And he was like, well, wait a second. What if I add things like he has SPA, which I think it stands for stick position attenuation. So it changes your PIDs based on how much deflection your stick is. And
Yeah.
he's like, so he's trying new things based on what he learned from silverware and other smaller projects, which is really, really cool.
Yeah. I mean the fantasy I suppose is that the silverware development transitions away from silverware, which is silverware is amazing but hard to work with, and that sort of gets consolidated into Emuflight, which is, easy to develop for and widely
Yeah,
and any Betaflight board can also run Emuflight.
right. And Joe Lucid, who created RPM filtering, got his start in silverware. So he took those bits that he started there, but his interest was in bigger quads. So he
Yeah.
goes and starts working on Betaflight on those bigger things. Does RPM filtering. This is what I love about our community. Then does JESC, and we find out that 48 kilohertz is amazing for tiny whoops, which reinvigorates him to work on tinies again, right? And it
Yeah.
all is just cyclical, and we're all feeding off of each other to make stuff fly
Yeah.
great.
And I'm really excited. One part of this that really excites me is because when Heliospring and Butterflight first came out, there was a lot of debate over whether their claims about filtering were true. And we'll no,
Yeah,
we're not here to rehash that. I don't know about you, but I'm not
we're not
qualified to
qualified.
rehash that.
Yeah,
Go ask Mark Spatz.
yeah.
And then Helio went away, and Emuflight picked up Butterflight, and it was kind of this question of like, well, why? I mean, in my mind, like, I guess you love the filtering, fine, it's your passion project. But now I'm excited to see this because this really is something that indisputably nobody else is doing, and that
Nope.
indisputably has benefits. And I would love to. I'm so excited that Emuflight is going to carve out this area for themselves in the micro world, and like maybe be the firmware for micros. I mean, is that what you see happening?
Yeah, for the foreseeable future, until we get not fast enough's latest little project that he's working on, Quicksilver. Yeah,
Oh,
it's gonna. I can't say much, but
okay.
it's pretty amazing. It's rethinking before, so yeah, it's rethinking a lot of stuff, and it's going from whoops to 5 inches. But what Kevin's doing with Emuflight is interesting because it's the first time angle code has been looked at since it was first put in, and he's actually working with like Bob Ruge and
Yeah.
figuring out like cine quads, like cine whoops, which
Interesting.
and putting in features that are like, what about a horizon mode that has a little bit of correction and it's all about smooth flying? Like, I love that they're looking into this market of micros up to a certain size when it gets into the cine whoop size that could be something that is a whole new market.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's amazing. I also think it's amazing just how many tunes you put out. Like it just seems like anytime there's a new hot micro, you are working on a tune for it. How many would you say you've tuned so far?
Oh my gosh. Um, how many I have tuned versus how many people want me to do is
Sure.
right. I would say probably at least 20 or so over the, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and
And
yeah,
how long does it take you to do like from the minute you start tuning? About how long does that take until you release something you feel good about?
I'm very picky. I actually lately, like if Newbie Drone sends me a new prototype board, usually an afternoon, I'll have something that I send back to them for them to fly. But then I really, 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 really test the hell out of it
Yeah.
because once you put it out there, then everybody starts using it, and once you build a reputation that something should fly out of the box fly really well. And I actually had an issue with that when I did the first Betaflight 4.0 Tiny Hawk tune. Um, my Tiny Hawk had sat on the shelf, and I got Betaflight came out with 4.0. I'm like, no, let's do it. And I got it flying, and people were like, "This is terrible." I'm like, "Oh no, what have I done?" I realized that my batteries were old, And I was like,
Oh,
people were saying, yeah, it's shaking. I'm like, uh-oh. So I got new batteries. I'm like, oh, what
wow.
a terrible thing, right? And that was the first time that I had rushed one out because I wanted to, people were just begging me to do a 4.0
Yeah.
tune. And so now I'm like, all right, that's why you see a lot of stuff that's in beta now, because I have
Right.
trusted people that
Right.
fly my tunes that I get feedback from. But now I do release it a little earlier so that people can just try it on all sorts of stuff. But yeah, I can probably do it in, if it's a 1S indoor angle, probably an afternoon.
Oh, it's not bad.
Yeah.
Now, do you tune? Now, we've been talking about angle mode and racing, but do you also tune for freestyle, right?
Yeah, my tunes all start in acro.
Sure.
And that's the problem. I recently moved to Portland, and so when I lived in California, somebody'd be like, "Oh yeah, Tiny Hawk S was a great example." I don't have an Emuflight tune for the Tiny Hawk S now because it started raining, and in Portland it
Oh,
rains
but it's
for,
indoor. It's indoor though. They're indoor quads, right?
yeah, but
Like,
a 2S, yeah.
yeah.
But that's what's kind of slowed me down. But yeah, I everything starts in acro, and I do freestyle all my quads, and you know, tiny whoops are no different. But for the most part, I can tune like all the latest newbie drone stuff is done in my house. Like I have
Yeah.
a nice tall ceiling in one of my rooms, so I can do some. But I do like to take it outside and really push limits and do. Everybody wants to dive, right? So you
Right.
got to have
Right.
a big pine tree to dive out here in Portland. So um,
Interesting.
when it's raining, hard to do that.
Yeah. How do you one of the things I've wondered is how you compensate for let's say air density in general. A lot of people don't know this, but air density, if you're it significantly changes your tune. If you fly a quad at sea level versus up in the mountains, essentially it like turning down, you get less thrust and lower P gains.
Yeah,
And when people have asked me to do like, would you do a tune for our quad? I'm not even sure how to approach that because you could tune it perfectly for your yard, and then somebody in Denver thinks it's undertuned, and somebody in Miami thinks it's overtuned.
yeah, it's just tough, right? And I even coming out here where it's a lot moister air
Mm-hmm.
than it is in California where I lived. I noticed differences, thicker air. So I don't know what else to do other than give a plus or minus. Like when people say, "Hey, it's doing this," I'm like, "Well, it sounds like you need to lower your P's a little, or maybe up your P's a little." Right? I don't know how else you can do it because there's no real way to have a test environment unless I
Right.
build a bubble.
That's next, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it feels like what you have to do is deliver it slightly undertuned. So the worst case scenario is it's a little sloppy.
yeah.
But
And that's
then
actually, yeah, how with Emuflight is the first time that my tune isn't what I fly. I did a baseline and I said, here's generally it should fly well. And like I said, it'll be a little twitchy, but that's on
Mhm.
purpose.
Right.
Then I'm hoping now with some of the tools that people have, it'll be easier for them to understand. Oh, I need to increase emu boost, or I need to do this to get a tighter feel. So I'm hoping that tuning is less what I do in the future, and it's more about teaching people how to get stick feel right.
Right. Interesting. I mean, that's always the goal. That's always. I mean, I again, we started the call with sort of a commonality that we had, and I feel like that's one too. Is that my goal is always just to teach people how to answer the questions for themselves, so that they can,
Yeah,
they don't have to contact me. Although they of course are always sounds like you're the same. They always
yeah,
are contacting, and you try to help where you can.
that's
Um,
right.
so these are available on your website. You have a website now.
Yep, I do have Project Mockingbird.squarespace.com, and that's where, when they're final, I put them up there. But I have been horrendously lazy about doing that
Okay.
because the Facebook group is, if anybody's really interested in what I'm doing, the Facebook group is just so much more active and honestly easier.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah. If you really want to get to what Project Mockingbird's doing right now, instead of the website, the Facebook group is the place to be. It's just a lot easier for me to put stuff up there, and there's a lot more communication, easier to communicate there as well. And people hit
Yeah.
me up on Messenger a lot.
Okay. Yeah, you got to get that website going and like, I don't know, get some ads up on it or something, get some traffic. Do you you give this stuff away for free, right? It's all just out
That
there.
yep, yep. The only
Okay.
thing I don't. Here's the thing: is like if I get paid for it, then I feel like I have to do it. If tomorrow,
I'm laughing. I know what you mean.
right, and right now, tomorrow, if I just wanted to focus on the Tiny Whoop Invitational that's coming up and not do another tune for 6 months, so be it.
Yeah.
And I appreciate people have wanted to give me money. Companies have sent me quads, not a lot of them, but that's what started the relationship with Newbie Drone. Is they were
Oh,
like,
sure.
we want you to do this, and I've always told them, I'm like, I will do it so long as there is no pressure uh, that I'm a quote Newbie Drone only pilot or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Sure.
They're great guys, but I want to do whatever makes me happy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can definitely identify with that as well. Well, well, Patrick, thank you very much for talking to us. I'm sure that a lot of people are going to be really happy to see the face behind the tunes, and
I don't know about happy.
I really appreciate you getting an opportunity to talk to you, and just to say thank you personally from me to you. That I'm gonna the time when you touched me the most
Oh dear.
was the original Tiny Hawk. I feel like it was like not like bad, but compared to the quads that it was released around, which was the Mobulus 7 and the Trash Can,
Yep.
it really flew worse than them. And I was like, it's okay, but and then I put the Mockingbird tune on it, and I was like, oh my god, night and day. This is an amazing quad,
And
and you saved that quad for me.
thank you. And that was one that I got talked into doing because I really didn't have 75 millimeter, stretch. I'm like, eh. And then somebody's like, no, please help me out. So I did it, and they're like, oh my god, this is amazing. I'm like, oh well, I'm
Yeah,
glad that helped. And then I saw your video. I'm like, there you go. That's why I do this, is so
there you
that
go.
people go, oh my god, this is great.
Emacs should be sending you a check. Anyway, all right, Patrick. Cool. Thank you so much. I'm gonna put links to your stuff, your Facebook group, your website, etc., down in the video description. And if you have a micro quad, beg Patrick to make a tune for it. And if you're thinking of getting a micro quad, I'm not joking when I say that the existence of a Project Mockingbird tune should be one of your deciding factors. But frankly, you tend to hit most of the really good ones.
Yeah,
So,
I try.
all right, good. Thank you,
All right.
Patrick.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Joshua. All right.
All right, great. Thank you, man.
Sweet. Oh,
That's
but
it.
before I let you go, by the way, Emuflight ripped out all the angle code, or sorry, all of the brushed code of
Yeah.
Betaflight, and it actually uses silverware code. So you're going to get 20 to 30% more power just by putting it on a brushed quad.
I don't think I have a brushed quad today, but that's okay.
Yeah, I know the brushed quads aren't like the hot thing anymore, but
No,
it basically puts silverware on a brushed quad, so
interesting.
you get all the benefits of
Do
it.
you
So
think?
I
I mean,
yeah.
when Newbie Drone, I think was well. I guess Jesse's probably the last holdout. Jesse has brushless too now, right? Or is he still doing brushed?
Yeah, no, he does. He has brushless, but it's a mixture of like parts, right?
Yeah. When Newbie Drone released a brushless, I was like, oh, this is it. Brushed is on because they were one of the last holdouts.
Yep.
So, I mean,
But
do you feel like brushed still has its place, or is
I
brushless
do,
the future?
I do like so a course that Jesse makes, like was what super tight and technical. A 19-gram brushed quad will absolutely kill a brushless
Wow,
quad.
that sounds
There
like
is a
an opportunity for a shootout.
it would be, and
That's interesting.
I've often thought of doing it. There's a linearity to a brushed motor and the response that a brushless motor doesn't have, and that's why 48 kilohertz actually kind of mimics that because it reduces braking.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's the next thing I'm chasing, is how do I get the same brushed feel but get the better top end, because
yeah,
brushless definitely has a better top end, but I think brushed has a better linear
yeah.
power band.
Interesting, interesting.
So
What if we took to like I don't know, Jesse We need like two really good racing pilots, and we blind them.
Yep.
We don't tell them what they've got, and
Well, that's
we have them race heats.
yeah. Like so, I don't know if you know. So there are two newbie drone pilots, Noodle, Del Sutton, and Anthony Knight, who is AK, and AK just won Utopia, the Utopia Winter one, right? They both run Hummingbirds, the newbie drone brushed ones.
Sure.
And even they admit on a tight technical course, they think they would be faster on a brushed. So it'd be interesting to see because AK has now switched over to the brushless newbie drone.
Yeah.
And I've challenged him, like, do you think you'd be faster? Make a tiny course and see which one's faster.
It's just tough because, like, how would you tune them? Like, to make sure that the tune wasn't the limiting factor.
And that is the thing because, I mean, he's running both of them are running my tune. So I try to get as close as possible, but it's not, this is where Mark would yell at me. He's like, there's nothing scientific about that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yep, because you know what? I think Jesse's actually faster on a brushed quad. It's just his jam.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. All right. Well, all right, cool, Patrick. Thank you. I'll let you.
No, thank you, man.
Have a good night. Have a good weekend.
Yep, you too, sir. All right.
Bye-bye, man.
Bye.